Welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author, Dr. David Pinault, the book, The Crucifix on Mecca's Front Porch, a Christian's Companion for the Study of Islam, published by our friends at Ignatius Press, available through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com. Welcome, Dr. David Pinault, to Bookmarks. First time we had a chance to talk about one of your books. People remember you were on with Father Mitch back in this past March, and it was great because, you know, Mitch knows so much about the Middle Eastern cultures, speaks Arabic, you know, and knows so much about Islam. It really was an engaging program. So let's focus on the book itself. What is a nice guy who's teaching out in Santa Clara doing, running around, giving talks and interviews in the Middle East, and how did you get interested in Islam?
Well, my interest in Islam really is tied up with longstanding interests in topics like archaeology and history. When I was 9 years old, my dad gave me a copy of something called the How and Why Wonder Book of Lost Cities.
I remember those books.
Yeah.
I had the How and Why Wonder Book of World War I. Shows what my interest was.
Right. So in any case, those are great starting points for kids, I think.
Right.
And so, I mean, I actually, years ago, worked as a volunteer digger at archaeological excavations in Israel, at Caesarea Maritima, Herod's city, in Jordan at Petra, you know. And which is a way of saying that for me the study of Islam is bound up with an interest in all the layers of history that go with the region, bound up with an interest in languages, culture, etc. And at the same time that I was studying languages like Arabic and Persian and so forth, I was also studying Greek and Latin. And part of what I set out to do in this particular book is to offer an introduction to Islam, but it's an introduction written by someone who is a lifelong Catholic. What I set out to do is to write an introduction for the general reader who happens to be Christian, and to do it in such a way that is sympathetic to Islam where possible, and respectful, etc., but that's also critically minded. And I say that because of the fact that what I find to be a drawback for all too many authors who are working in this area, there's sometimes a reluctance to criticize Islam. And the reason why is because of an understandable feeling of let's all get along.
Right.
And that desire for all of us to get along can then sometimes lead to what I feel is a mistaken attempt to minimize the radical differences between Islam and Christianity. And I feel that that does a disservice to both faiths.
Well, it seems like in some ways, and I think you're trying to, you know, take that via media in a sense of there are some books out there that are somewhat polemical, very anti-Islamic, focused on the radicals. Then there's others, like you said, who are writing these books to try to make everybody seem like everybody's okay, or that being a Christian living in a country that's under Sharia law really wasn't so bad historically, you know, etc. Things like that. And I think you try to kind of, like you said, show it the way it actually is. Now, what is Mecca's front porch? Now, is that in Mecca at the Grand Mosque? There's a big porch everybody goes to. What is it?
Okay, good. So let me explain. First of all, that's a geographic designation, and it's a translation of a phrase from Indonesian, from the Indonesian language, Serambi Mecca, which means Mecca's front porch. What it refers to is a province in Indonesia, and I should mention here that Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, is the world's largest Muslim country by population.
Which is surprising to most people.
That's right, because only 18% of the world's Muslim population is Arab. That means 82% is non-Arab, and the biggest Muslim country is Indonesia. Anyways, so in this archipelago island chain, what's called Mecca's front porch, that's a nickname for the province of Aceh, which is located in the northern part of the island of Sumatra. And Aceh is that part of Indonesia that geographically lies closest to the Arabian Peninsula. And for that reason, for many centuries, Aceh has been the embarkation point, the jump-off point for Muslim pilgrims making the Hajj. That's the required pilgrimage to Mecca. Okay, and so Mecca's front porch.
How often do you need to do that? Once in your life?
Yeah, once in your life, if you're able to, at least. People who can afford to will do it more than once. And so Aceh is also the only part of Indonesia that is governed by Sharia law. Okay, and there's a minority population there of Buddhists and especially Christians who, in these circumstances, have undergone sometimes savage and brutal persecution at the hands of some of their Muslim majority neighbors. So a few years ago I went there to investigate the situation for myself, and I had the privilege of being able to attend Catholic Mass one Sunday morning. Got there early and I saw the procession making its way up the center aisle. Priests, worshipers, acolytes, and leading them all was a young girl holding high a big bronze cross with the figure of Christ on it. That left a very strong visual impression on me at the sight of this girl lovingly, but also defiantly, holding aloft the body of Christ on the cross right on Mecca's front porch. And I said to myself, this is something I want to carry forward into the book itself.
And those people, would they have come out of like the Portuguese kind of Catholic influence? What would have been the influence? The Dutch, the Portuguese? Who would have been the influence from a Christian side in Indonesia?
Yeah, so I mean, historically, Indonesia had been a Dutch colonial possession. In fact, that particular building I was in dated from the Dutch period. And the Christians who are there represent a variety of ethnicities. Some from the island of Java, for example, some ethnic Malay, some ethnic Chinese, and so forth. Small scattering of foreigners from the West. But all united by their love of Christ.
Okay. Now you said when you started off, you were talking about archaeology, a vocation as an Orientalist.
Yes.
Now, that seems like a non-PC word anymore.
Yes.
What was at least an Orientalist,
Yeah, well,
and what would you be today?
That's right. Well, of course, the thing is that I still use the term from time to time of myself. You may be aware of the fact that, first of all, traditionally the term Orientalist simply means a specialist in the field of Oriental studies, and in its most general sense. But in the 19th century, it was really used to refer to non-Muslims who are specialists in Islam. Okay? Right? And then in 1977, a polemicist by the name of Edward Said wrote a book called Orientalism, in which he identified Orientalists as something bad because he said, here you have Westerners, outsiders, non-Muslims, studying Islam as tools of imperialism. And so almost overnight, Orientalist becomes a negative word. But in fact, I took my PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies from a department of Oriental Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And occasionally, I'll still say to my students the first day of the quarter, I'll say, you're going to get this course in Islam from someone who happens to be a Christian. I'm an Orientalist. I remember one time a young woman raising her hand and saying, Dr. Pinault, don't say that. You're a nice man.
Right. You can't be using it. And you also mentioned the fact is, you had at least one case you mentioned in the book, I remember, where a father came and said, well, you're teaching Islam to my son. And you're using the word critical in there. That makes me nervous. And he made the point like, well, you're bringing Christian students to introduce them to Islam to understand it better. I would never take an Islamic student and introduce him to Christianity. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
That approach.
A couple of things to mention there. One is that I have occasionally had the experience of Muslim parents stopping by my office. I teach at Santa Clara University, which, as you may know, is a Catholic Jesuit university. But I have students of all different faith backgrounds, in my classes. And so once in a while I've had Muslim parents stop by and say to me, well, I can tolerate the thought of a Christian teaching a course in Islam as long as you understand, David, that your job is to defend Islam. And I say, no, excuse me, that's not my job. My job is to investigate Islam, sympathetically where I can, but always in a critical sense. And I try to go where the evidence leads. So, and if that causes a bit of discomfort for people, sometimes discomfort is a good starting point for learning. Right.
You mentioned about your own undergrads, unchurched and largely ignorant of their own Christian heritage, idealistic, spiritually adrift, are vulnerable to such pitches for Muslim missionaries. I mean, I don't actually think in terms, are there Muslim missionaries out and about?
Absolutely, yeah. One thing to keep in mind is that something that Islam shares in common with Christianity, both are world faiths that are missionary in their orientation.
Right.
And so, it's understandable then that Muslims evangelize, and that's a reality to be taken into account. And of course, there's an interesting irony at work because of the fact that here in the United States, of course, you have Muslims of very imaginable faith background. In the San Francisco Bay Area where I teach, for example, you have not only Sunni and Shia mosques, but also mosques representing minority denominations such as Ismailis, Ahmadis, Sufis, etc.
And which you talk about in the book.
Yeah, I talk about this in the book.
Right.
Well, the interesting thing is that in their home countries, Ahmadis and Shias, Ismailis, and so forth, are often persecuted.
Right.
And so many Muslims that I have met who live in the United States express gratitude for the fact that here they can practice whatever denomination they want freely.
Right. I think maybe we might think it's the way we think, at least in these days, of other denominations where, if you're a Catholic, there's Methodists and Baptists, and we all get along, and yes, we have some differences, but it's not really a big deal.
Right.
Where it's not really that way for them.
Yeah, that's
outside of the United States.
Yes, and one thing that I talk about in the book in terms of differences between Sunnis and Shias, when I've had the experience of working in Pakistan, I've actually been invited by Muslim groups and say at the University of Peshawar, for example, in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan, right near the Afghan border and so forth.
And that area has been mentioned many times over the last 20 years.
That's right. And the reason why I was asked to give a lecture on Islam, to Muslim students at this university is because of the fact that Sunni Shia sectarianism and intersectarian resentment is so strong. There's constant outbreaks of violence over these issues. And so because I've published in the field of Sunni Shia studies, they asked me to give public presentations on the history of the Sunni Shia split and possible paths to reconciliation. And when I initially was a little bit startled, why are you asking me? They said, well, you're not on one side or the other, so we're going to go to you as a kind of arbiter, to lay out some possible paths.
Saying that maybe you're not coming with a bias that we would assume on the other side. Well, that's something, we think in terms of, we talk about all the denominations in Christianity, etc. today, and we could go back to the major split between the division between East and West in the Catholic Church, and then obviously the Luther post-period. Yeah. But in understanding why was there a split in Islam between Shia and Sunni as the two big ones, and what's different about each one? What do they actually believe that's different that causes them so much agita for each other?
Yeah, well, just very briefly, what I would mention is that this goes back to a succession over a dispute as to who should be the leader of the Ummah, that is the community of believers, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the year 632. So originally it was a political split that then evolved distinctive spiritualities. The political split had to do with the question of, okay, who's entitled to be the caliph? Okay, the term caliph is from the Arabic phrase Khalifat Rasulullah, which means the successor to Allah's messenger. Okay. All right, because Muhammad is revered as the last prophet in Islam, but someone has to be the caliph, his successor, to be the political executor of God's will, that kind of thing. And so there was one group that said basically, well, it's up to humans to decide. We will elect somebody. And that group became known as the Sunnis. But there was a minority group that felt that since humans are capable of error, it must be only Allah who can choose. And Allah's will is to choose someone from what's called Ahlul Bayt, someone from the bloodline of the family of Muhammad himself, believing in then a kind of divinely guided
Almost like a Davidic kind of
Yeah, that's right.
connection
Yeah,
going
that's right.
on. Okay.
Divinely guided bloodline of the Prophet Muhammad. They became known as the Shias. So originally it was simply a kind of dynastic dispute, and then
Was it Muhammad's uncle or somebody? Was that one?
well,
of the
so
ones?
that the belief was that Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law,
Okay.
whose name was Ali ibn Abi Talib, Ali was married to Muhammad's daughter Fatima.
Okay.
And so the belief among the Shias is all the leaders have to be chosen from that bloodline
Okay.
of Ali and Fatima. And then what happened when Ali's son Hussein was killed by fellow Muslims at the Battle of Karbala in Iraq in the year 680, then after that, special forms of ritual devotion evolved among the Shias commemorating the battlefield death of Hussein. That's very distinctively Shia.
Okay.
So that's sort of it very briefly.
Now, you said in the book, you make the note that I provide my own translation of various Islamic primary source materials.
Mm-hmm.
A number of these passages I've translated appear in English for the first time. You say, the translations I give are meant to shine a hard, harsh light on such texts. How so?
Well, because of the fact that I mentioned in the book, for example, that I do my own translating from the Quran, because there have been previous translations of the Quran in which the authors, I think, are trying to sort of wish away some of the harsher phrasing. And I, you know, to give them as much credit as I can, I think it's because they want to minimize tensions and so forth. Mm-hmm. But the thing that I need to point out, I feel, is that those Muslims who are militantly minded, I mean, luckily, militant Muslims are in the minority, you know, but those who are militant sincerely believe that they're following Allah's will in imitating Muhammad. And I think that it's necessary to draw attention to those texts. In other words, it's not enough just to say, oh, the people who commit violence, those are just loonies, they've got nothing to do with Islam.
Right.
No, they got everything to do with Islam. It's not the only possible interpretation, but I know from having had the dubious privilege of interviewing some of these militant representatives in countries like Yemen and Indonesia, okay, and Pakistan, that they see themselves as following directly, imitating the Prophet Muhammad. Right? And I think that that needs to be acknowledged, even though there are also plenty of Muslims who sincerely are trying to follow a path of peace.
Right, you say American converts to Islam, or reverts as they prefer to call themselves, they spoke fervently how their lives had now acquired direction and meaning. Why would they call themselves reverts?
Oh, well, that's because of the fact that there's a belief in Islam that everyone is originally a Muslim. This stems from a verse in chapter 7 of the Quran that talks about how before the world itself was created, the souls of everyone who would ever be born were assembled together, and Allah appears to us and says, "Am I not your Lord?" And we said yes. And so that demonstrates that originally we were all Muslims, and it's only an accident of birth that might have given us the misfortune, say, to have been born a Christian or something like that.
So how did Roger Williams show up in this book?
Yeah, well, this has to do with the fact that Roger Williams, okay, of course, he's the person who founded Rhode Island, okay, and that's where I'm from.
Okay.
All right, I'm from Providence myself,
Okay.
right? So he's a founding father for me, and he is someone who it's very, very interesting. He established Rhode Island as a haven for people of conscience. You know, he basically had to flee from Boston, okay, because of the fact that you know, he differed from fellow Puritans on a number of issues of conscience, okay? And if you're familiar with the history of Rhode Island, you may know that what wound up happening was that he was willing to take in people being persecuted, such as Quakers, okay? Individuals who were being persecuted by, you know, the dominant Christian denomination at that time, okay? And you know, he even made statements to the effect that, you know, if there happened to be a Turk, and by that he means a Mohammedan or a
Yeah,
Muslim.
it's,
right?
it's used synonymously.
That,
right?
that in the
Okay.
17th century, because
Right.
the Turks,
Yeah.
right, the Ottoman Empire
was right.
launching annual jihad campaigns against Christian Europe.
Right, exactly.
That's
Battle
part of the
of Vienna,
history.
et cetera,
That's right, which people tend to forget
Yeah,
today, but that's real history.
I know some people in Poland who remember it
Exactly
quite vividly.
Right. Yes, and with good reason. And
Right.
with good reason.
Right.
And so what he was saying was, listen, any person who comes here in peace, like regardless of their faith background, okay, they can have a home here.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things I point out in the book is that what I'm trying to do is, in a sense, to imitate his example. He's willing to give people a home, but at the same time, Roger Williams was willing to engage in religious debate, for example, with the Quakers, whom he welcomed, right? He engaged them in debate. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that
Without acting like just because I'm open to you practicing your religion, it doesn't mean that I believe you're correct.
Exactly. In other words, here's a home for you, but this does not mean that I'm going to try to
But he also didn't make them second-class citizens
Exactly
who had
right.
to pay a tax to live in their particular
Right, which is the circumstance in Muslim countries, that
right.
enforce Sharia.
Right, which
so
we don't like to talk about. The argument in this book is that the study of Islam can give Christians fresh appreciation for the distinctive beauties and strengths of their own religion. And then you say, caveat lector.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, it's let the reader beware.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things that I point out is that I do feel, and basing this on personal experience, that for me, the study of Islam and living in Muslim countries has served to strengthen my own faith as a Catholic Christian, okay? And because what I have found is that you have this situation where the Quran mentions Jesus almost 100 times.
Right.
But in doing so, it rejects the foundations of the Christian faith. And so if you've had the experience of living in a Muslim country and letting people know, not in a flashy way, but just letting people know whenever they ask, yes, I am a Christian, I'm a Catholic, then inevitably you're going to have people coming up to you and saying, so what's all this with the Trinity?
Right.
What's all this business with incarnation? What's all this with the crucifixion? Right? Because these are things that are denied by Islam. And so it really throws you back on yourself to reflect. Right. And because what do these things mean to me? And then how do I present it to Muslim neighbors who are asking me?
Right, because you're being challenged.
Yeah.
And that's why it's interesting to see in many cases those people like on Mecca's Porch are the strongest in their faith because they have to fight for their faith.
Exactly right.
And
because we have the luxury in this
Right.
country of taking things that are essential for granted, and that's really, we need a wake-up call.
Right. You say, I will draw particular attention to 3 areas where I believe Christianity strongly diverges from Islam. You talk about the self-emptying experience of the second person of the Trinity becoming man, which they obviously reject. God's solidarity with created beings and suffering undergone by all those who are sent into this world, which obviously is not where they're coming from, and the redemptive passion of Christ in the death on the cross. Because it's interesting to see how they incorporated Christ, but in like a docetist kind of approach where it seems like they can't make up their mind whether he was just a nice guy who was kind of there, or whatever he did, he certainly couldn't have suffered because he really wasn't quite a man.
So let me try to clarify this very important point. I'm so glad that you brought this up.
Right.
According to Islam, Jesus was a Muslim, a slave of Allah, and a prophet of Islam. And the thing to understand here is that the Prophet Muhammad viewed various familiar figures from the Bible, such as Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, as fellow Muslims and fellow prophets preaching Allah's word. Now, here's the thing. Because Muhammad himself was a military and political success in his own lifetime, my view is that Muhammad then sort of projected that notion backward in time. And so, to me, that's a key reason why the Quran rejects the crucifixion. Because the Quran says, in truth, we will make our prophets and the believers We will deliver them in this life. We will rescue them, make them successful, both in this world and in the next life.
Right.
The crucifixion, in Muhammad's eyes, represents simply humiliation and defeat.
Defeat, right.
Okay, the God who is presented in the Quran, one of the so-called beautiful names of Allah in the Quran is Il-Ghani, which means the one who is free of any needs, the one who needs us not at all. And there are various sayings of Muhammad in which God is described in terms that says things like, whether you worship God or not, he doesn't need that. It makes no difference to God.
It's interesting, right?
Yeah, okay.
In hearing it that way, in a sense, because then they would see us with having a God who needs to be in relation with us as being needy.
Yes, exactly.
And he can't be needy.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, Allah is presented in the Quran as invulnerable. Okay? Yes, he is merciful to us as a master to a slave, okay? Right? He's merciful to us, but that's radically different from what you have in Christianity, because in Christianity, we have a God who is so reckless in his love for us that he's willing to become human and thereby share in our condition of being vulnerable.
Right.
God becomes vulnerable out of loving solidarity with us. And that, in my life, has meant a tremendous amount to me, so that I can know in whatever I go through in my existence in terms of anguish and suffering, that I know that Christ has been there as a pioneer before me.
So in doing what you've done over the years and in writing books like this, it's strengthened your faith?
Yes, yes, I would definitely say that.
And you think that's something that a person who picking this book up may find happen for them as well?
Quite possibly.
While getting a good understanding of Islam in an appropriate way. Okay.
That's what I'm hoping for.
We're just out of time. Do you have another book in the works?
Well, one of the things that I'm hoping to do, actually, is to write some more fiction. I've already published one novel.
Okay.
Which is called Museum of Seraphs in Torment, and I'm hoping to do some more, which will weave in both my interests as a Christian and historical interests as well.
Well, we appreciate you putting this book together and stopping by Bookmark.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Here at EWTN, Dr. David Pinault, and the book is The Crucifix on Mecca's Front Porch, a Christian's Companion for the Study of Islam, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. It's a very interesting read, very accessible. Check it out. Check us out next time, right here on EWTN's Bookmark. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug.